Good morning. In my lecture today, I shall be commenting on the cultural and political writings in Kannada. There is a very distinctive tradition in modern Kannada literature of all major creative writers participating in the cultural and political debates in the public sphere. However, the nature of this participation is not of the kind that we find elsewhere, of a very superficial kind and of a direct involvement in the actual politics of the time. Instead, the major creative writers in Kannada have constructed and created the major discourses through which the Kannada community has tried to understand the problems of the contemporary Kannada society. This is a continuous tradition which can be traced from the early decades of the 20th century, which coincide with the new rise or the new dawn or Navodaya as it is known in Kannada, and it is to be seen even now. Most of the Kannada writers have taken up the role of public intellectuals, maintaining a very close and intimate relationship with the civil society in Karnataka. They have always kept their writings open in a dialogue with the community which the writing addresses. For example, if we look at the major writers of the Navodaya period, which also happened to be the period when the great movement for the unification of Karnataka took place, we can notice that most of the discourses about Kannada and Kannada identity were created by the creative writers in Kannada, and then they were circulated in Kannada society. And that is how the writings of Kannada writers have contributed a great deal, not only in shaping the modern sensibility in Kannada, but also of creating a very lively and multi-pronged debate on all those political and cultural issues which are of relevance to Kannada society. In fact, it has also been noticed that the insights into a large number of social issues in Karnataka have come from the creative writers and not from the social scientists as it should have been. In fact, the intervention of the major Kannada writers in these public debates have also been responsible for the new and very fresh insights, not only into the structures of the society, but also into questions of the power structure at the political level and also at the cultural level. If we take, for example, what happened during the Navodaya period, we find that the major discourses regarding Kannada identity were created in a very unique and specific manner by the leaders of the movement, who also happened to be very important writers. For example, Masti Venkatesh Iyengar, generally known as the father of the Kannada short story and also an important novelist, also wrote very prolifically on the cultural and the political issues of the time. He edited and also published a number of journals, and the editorials that he wrote for his own journal, Jivana, have now been collected, and the cultural and the political writings of Masti, which he contributed to the journals of the time, run into several volumes. Though a conservative in both political and cultural terms, Masti Venkatesh Iyengar shows in his political writings a very keen awareness of the political scenario, not only in India but also elsewhere. This brings us to a very important characteristic of the cultural writings in Kannada. These writings have kept the Kannada sensibility continuously in dialogue with the rest of the world, not only in dialogue with what is happening elsewhere in India, but also outside India. Therefore, though Kannada is usually seen as a regional language, very deeply rooted in a regional culture, Kannada sensibility has kept itself open to the pressures of the contemporary world. In fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that even in the creative writings of the 20th century, one can see the consequences of this very creative dialogue with the rest of the world. For example, most of the very important political and cultural turns and twists of the early part of the 20th century, they find a reflection in the creative writings in Kannada. But at the same time, the major writers who were bringing modern Kannada literature into existence by their voluminous writings were also contributing very prolifically towards the cultural and the political debates. In fact, one could say, from reading the biography of the major figures of the early 20th century in Kannada, that they paid a fairly heavy cost of not being able to put forth the creative writing they were capable of because of their active involvement in the contemporary issues of politics and culture. If we look back at the Navodaya period, we find an attempt made by at least 2 or 3 very important writers to conceptualize the identity of Kannada in the modern world. One of them is B.M. Shrikantaya, popularly known as B.M. Shri. B.M. Shri was responsible for ushering in modern poetry in Kannada through his translations of the British Romantic and Victorian poems. But that apart, B.M. Shri was one of the best known public intellectuals of the time who contributed to the discourses on Kannada and Kannada modernity. He was advocating a Kannada modernity which would now draw its strength and sustenance from English. In his major essays and speeches, B.M. Shri argues that until the beginning of the 20th century, Kannada literature in its earlier phases had drawn its models, its strength from Sanskrit and also from the other Indian sources. Now in the 20th century, it was time for Kannadigas to revive the Kannada sensibility by looking towards the West and especially towards the colonial modernity, which according to B.M. Shri was not just an accident of history. It was maybe destined for the Kannada community to confront the modernity shaped by the West so that it would ultimately be able to discover a modernity of its own. In the writings of B.M. Shri, we find him proposing a somewhat paradoxical view of how this Kannada modernity can be sustained. On the one hand, he suggests that since English literature was a repository of modernity in the West, and it was also a repository of the modern humanist values, it was very appropriate for Kannada writers to seek their inspiration and sustenance in English literature. On the other hand, B.M. Shri, being a political conservative, did not seem to have much of a problem with the existence of monarchy here in the Mysore Principality, of which he was a part, nor did he have a critique to offer of the colonial British administration. Not only in the metaphors that he uses in his poetry, but also in his cultural and political writings, B.M. Shri tries to propose a modernity for Kannada which could be constructed under the rubric of, on the one hand, colonial administration and colonial modernity, and also the monarchy here in the Mysore Principality. Later writers and critics have taken objection to the way in which B.M. Shri did not see the paradox in the paradigm, in the model that he was proposing for Kannada modernity. However, historically, it is true that it was B.M. Shri who not only introduced modernity into the Kannada scenario, he also showed possibilities for the future development of the modern sensibility in Kannada literature. Kuvempu is another very important thinker who contributed to the notion of Kannada identity. In fact, Kuvempu's ideas have had relevance for the later phases in modern Kannada literature, despite the very deep changes that took place in the political and the cultural world. Kuvempu, in his cultural writings, talks basically about three things. One is his conceptualization of Kannada and Karnataka. He does not see Karnataka as merely a geopolitical entity. In fact, to quote a very well-known phrase from him, for him, Kannada is a space in the consciousness. It should not be confined to a geographical or a political boundary. This is a federalist view of the language Kannada in the modern political world. Kuvempu, in fact, was drawing his inspiration from the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi, who also did not see any kind of space for a conflict between the regional languages or the bhashas in India and the federalist government, which perhaps political thinkers of the time were looking forward to. Kuvempu uses a number of metaphors in order to draw our attention to the fact that what is required is a coexistence for Kannada language and Kannada literature, along with all the traditions that we have in the Indian scenario. He deliberately emphasizes the fact that Kannada culture itself is pluralistic in nature. He looks at it essentially as a many-voiced culture. For example, in a very famous song on Kannada and Kannada culture, which has now become the state anthem of Karnataka, he describes the Kannada land of his imagination as a garden of many faiths, many religions, and many languages. Obviously, the ideas of Kuvempu regarding Kannada identity were totally free from any kind of cultural or linguistic parochialism. Nor did he see the other linguistic traditions in India as any kind of threat to the space occupied by Kannada in the modern world. This has been a very beneficial influence for the later conceptualization of Kannada and the identity of Karnataka. One can say with confidence that throughout the 20th century and also in these decades of the 21st century, the civil society in Karnataka has always kept itself away from very narrow and parochial notions of linguistic and cultural identity. This has happened because writers like Kuvempu and also a thinker like Aluru Venkat Rao made sure that from the very beginning of the movement for the unification of Karnataka, Kannada and Karnataka would be looked at as composite figures comprising a number of influences from the other linguistic and cultural traditions. Aluru Venkat Rao, generally known as the archpriest of the unification movement, is also a very important political thinker. He is the one who tried to conceptualize the nature of the very essence of being a Kannadiga in the modern world. He contributed the term Karnatakatva to the theoretical writings on Kannada and Kannada identity during this period. This notion of Karnatakatva is very unique in the sense it cuts across the boundaries of politics, of caste and class, and tries to look at the essence of being a Kannadiga as trying to occupy a spiritual position. about the nature of the linguistic identity. He tries to separate the practical agenda for establishing a modern linguistic state called Karnataka from the Kannada land which has been imagined for centuries in the Kannada tradition. So it was Alur Venkat Rao who was already looking ahead and thinking of the genuinely federalist nature of the Indian polity. And he was suggesting that in the time to come, if freedom and the dream of freedom were to be realized politically, then the linguistic states in India should imagine a harmonious coexistence. This is a theme to which Alur Venkat Rao returns frequently. He drew inspiration for his political programs and for his activism from the example of Lokamanya Tilaka in Maharashtra. And he also drew up a large number of public programs on the model of what was happening in Maharashtra. But at the same time, he was also trying to evolve a sense of Kannada identity which would be open to the multiple pressures of a modern political entity and a modern political society which was being created at that time. Kuvempu also wrote very prolifically about the relationship between Kannada and English. In the recent debates on Kannada as the medium of instruction in schools and also the public controversy regarding the government trying to introduce English from standard 1 in the schools in Karnataka. It is the writings of Kuvempu which were brought to the foreground again and debated in the civil society in Karnataka, mainly because the writings of Kuvempu have a relevance to some of the contemporary problems relating to the status of Kannada and English. Kuvempu, who had earlier written that English was a force of liberation for him, it was able to liberate him from the confines of being an individual born in the cultural backwaters without access to the opportunities in the literary establishment, later went on to become a devout follower of the Kannada cause. In fact, a very large portion of his later writings is about Kannada, and it is also about the possible threats that the English language holds for a regional language like Kannada. Therefore, we find in the political and cultural writings of Kuvempu a very sensitive awareness of the way in which Kannada, English, linguistic identity and modernity were, how these things were playing a very important role in the contemporary world. In fact, his writings about not only English but about modernity and the uses of the past have been found to be abiding discourses which keep returning to the very center of all the cultural debates in Kannada. In his cultural writings, he also takes a very strong oppositional stand, critiquing the major religious and the philosophical traditions in India, and also talking about how the power structure in the Indian traditions has prevented the expression of the experiences of the subaltern people. These were comments that Kuvempu had made in a very different historical and cultural context, but they seem to be far more relevant in the contemporary Kannada scenario of the 21st century. So the major writers of the New Dawn, New Rise period, which coincides with the pre-independence period in Karnataka, contributed very meaningfully to the political and the cultural debates of the time. A mention has to be made here of a colossal figure as far as cultural writings in Kannada is concerned. This is Shamba Joshi, who addressed very different issues and themes in his voluminous writings. He was probably the first great scholar to try to create a new framework of analysis as far as the Indian civilization is concerned. He had a very ambitious intellectual project of exploring almost the entire body of religious and philosophical writing available in India and try to see how a very important civilizational shift took place sometime in the past history. He is of the opinion that from a solar phase of the worship of the sun and the worship of the intellect and rationality, there happened a shift in the Indian civilization towards the lunar, and that led to a decline of the civilization itself and ultimately to the worship of the irrational. One cannot think of a towering intellectual of this period who can equal Shamba Joshi in the very reach of his imagination and the number of fields of knowledge that he employs in order to support his arguments, from anthropology to etymology, from history to the study of culture. All these fields of knowledge are very intelligently employed by Shamba Joshi in order to create a huge framework which looks into not just language but also into the symbols of culture, into architecture, into archival resources in order to understand what happened in the long history of Indian civilization. This yeoman work by Shamba did not find followers as soon as the writings of Shamba were published, but in recent years there has been a lot of interest shown by researchers and scholars in the Kannada scenario into the writings of Shamba Joshi. One can see that as I had mentioned a while ago, Shamba himself is an example of Kannada scholarship being in very intimate dialogue with what was happening in the intellectual world outside India. One can see the influence of major Western scholars like Ernest Cassirer on Shamba. But he not only draws from all these very, very diverse sources for his intellectual work, he is also able to create what can be described as a very indigenous model for the study of culture and civilization. If this is a brief note on the kind of contribution made to culture and politics, not only by direct intervention but by through prolific writing during the pre-independence period, one has also to say that there is a very similar kind of plurality when we look at the cultural and political writings in the later phase of modern Kannada literature. Though of course the modernist phase known as Navya in Kannada is said to have developed a sensibility and a consciousness not very open to the challenges of the social realities of the society. We find that it is the major writers of the Navya period who took direct part in the cultural and the political debates of the time. For example, Gopalakrishna Adiga, who ushered in modernity into Kannada poetry and who also created the aesthetics for modernist Kannada writing, also wrote very prolifically on political and cultural issues. He not only translated a very important work by Ram Manohar Lohia into Kannada, he also made use of the space available to him as editor of a very leading literary journal of the time, Sakshi, to talk about the political events of the time. Adiga talks about the decline of the public values, the decline of the value-based politics, and the consequences of a shift from the Gandhian politics to the Nehruvian politics. In fact, it can be said that Gopalakrishna Adiga was a major influence on a whole generation of Navya writers, even as far as their cultural and political writings are concerned. Two of the younger writers who learned their lessons from Gopalakrishna Adiga, namely U.R. Ananthamurthy and P. Lankesh, went on to become iconic figures as far as the cultural scenario in Kannada and Karnataka is concerned. U.R. Ananthamurthy declares in his very early critical and prose writings that his major objective was to bring Kannada writing in close contact with the political world. This is the declared intention of U.R. Ananthamurthy, as he explains it in a prefatory note to one of his early collections of prose writings. From his early writings right up to the present, U.R. Ananthamurthy has been at the very center of most of the political and the cultural debates that have taken place in Kannada civil society. He was also responsible for bringing together very diverse streams. On the one hand, he brought in a modernity of a Laurentian kind, a criticism which owed a great deal to the new critic F.R. Lewis. But at the same time, he was also responding to the ideologies of Gandhi and especially Ram Manohar Lohia. Perhaps at this point, I should also highlight the fact that certain ideological streams have had a very lasting influence on the cultural and the political writings in Kannada. These ideological positions are namely the first one being the Marxist position, then the Lohiite position, then the broad socialist position, slightly diverging from the position of Lohia, and also the Gandhian ideological position. These have been the major models, major theoretical perspectives which have given inspiration to the cultural and the political writings in Kannada. In fact, one could say that the political and cultural writings in Kannada have been a huge effort in order to use these intellectual resources drawn from these ideological positions to apply them to the contemporary events and issues, not only in Karnataka but in India. The writers of the generation of U.R. Ananthamurthy were very heavily under the influence of the ideas of Ram Manohar Lohia, and this, I think, has remained one of the major strands of the cultural and political thinking in Karnataka. The major ideas of Ram Manohar Lohia proposing a kind of a balance between a Gandhian notion of a village economy and a more liberal attitude towards a specific use of technology in the modern world. This has provided an acceptable model to the modern Kannada writers. Gandhi has been a very major source of influence, even on major writers who are known as Dalit writers in Karnataka. In fact, a very substantial amount of writing in modern Kannada, it is about this attempt to bridge the ideology of Gandhi with the ideological positions of Lohia and also Ambedkar. During the decade of the 1970s, which saw the foregrounding of Dalit writing in Karnataka, it's obvious that the major influence on our cultural writing should have been Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. It was during this particular decade that a very lively and a very complex debate took place on the original writings of B.R. Ambedkar, and also of how these ideas of Ambedkar could be put to new uses vis-a-vis the new society that was emerging here. There were, of course, some dissentient voices also from the perspective of the Ambedkarite ideology, that Gandhi was no longer relevant, nor could one make any kinds of an intellectual compromise with the Gandhian position if one were thinking of the Dalit communities and their political status in modern Karnataka. However, gradually there seems to have been a number of intellectual attempts made to bring together the Gandhian political praxis and the Gandhian notion of a conscience-based attitude towards the caste system and the Ambedkarite theoretical position of proposing the annihilation of caste. One example of this attempt to bring together the Ambedkarite and Gandhian ideology are the political and cultural writings of Devanur Mahadeva. Most of these writings have been recently collected in book form. They belong to roughly 3 decades, and they are a very sensitive record of all the major political and cultural events which have taken place in Karnataka in the last 3 decades. But apart from this, the writings of Devanur Mahadeva, they address a very large number of issues. They are about Dalit identity, the confrontation between Dalit identity and modern politics, then the realities of an actual political entity called Karnataka society, and the attempt to shape the ideology of this society towards a position which would be acceptable to the followers of Ambedkar. Such are the very diverse issues addressed by Devanur Mahadeva in his writings. Another very important characteristic of the political and the cultural writings in Kannada has been that these writings have taken a very strong and a very consistent stand. They have supported secularism, they have supported the notion of a pluralistic society, and they have always supported the coexistence of many religions, many traditions, and many cultures, and the idea that ultimately Kannada culture itself is a kind of a loose federal structure which tries to bring together these diverse elements which constitute its cultural basis and the regional basis. One can see a very important continuity in the cultural and the political thoughts in Kannada. In the sense, the Kannada literary establishment has never come out in support of a caste society. It has always been extremely critical of the many hierarchies in Indian society. It has always been against all the philosophical traditions in India which try to categorize human beings into those who are capable of being liberated and those who are condemned to live very difficult lives. It is the tradition of Kannada literature to come out openly in support of a humanist, secular worldview. This can be seen not only in the writings of the pre-independence period, but also in what we find around us in the writings of the contemporary generation. Two important themes became the subject of cultural and political writings in the 1980s and also later in the 1990s. One was the very important response that the literary community in Karnataka made to the question of the rise of the communal forces in modern India. There were a number of events in Karnataka, and these were events which were indicating that certain counter ideologies supportive of the right wing, supportive of the communalist forces were emerging. It was during this period that Kannada writers came together and fought a very strong battle against these forces. It's not just a question of activism. One can see that in a decade and a half, during which these major events took place in Karnataka society, a number of discourses were created on the notion of secularism. Here one can cite examples of the writings of Anantmurthy, Rahmat Tarikere, Purnachandra Tejasvi, G. Rajshekhar and Fani Raj. All these important figures in Kannada society were trying not only to repeat the liberal Western notion of secularism, they were trying to find ways of reviving the tradition of tolerance in Indian society. This, I think, should be considered as a major contribution of the cultural and political writings in Kannada to the very tradition of the Indian intellectual pursuit in the contemporary world. Because here were the writers in Kannada who were trying to reinterpret the meaning of secularism, drawing very greatly on the indigenous resources of secularism. For example, there were scholarly books on the Sufi traditions in Karnataka, and there were also historical interpretations of the coming together of the Hindu and the Islamic traditions in rural Karnataka. There were also attempts made to see how even in the pre-colonial period, the Kannada sensibility had remained very distinctive, and it had never supported the narrow nationalistic positions which were so very dominant elsewhere in India. Similarly, it is during these decades that I am referring to, namely the 1980s and the 1990s, that the cultural writings begin to focus on the relationship between the human existence and the survival of ecology and the sustenance of the environment. This interest in the environment as far as the cultural writings in Kannada are concerned are not superficial. No lip service is being paid only to the myriad programs being proposed for protecting the rivers and the forests, etc. What happens in the Kannada scenario is an in-depth exploration begins to be made of the very intimate relationship between human civilization and the environment and the ecology. In fact, the creative writings of Purnachandra Tejasvi are a monumental effort in order to understand the relationship between the human world and the world of nature. So, it is during these decades that on the one hand, you have a very major creative writer making ecology and environment his major concern in his creative writings, and at the same time, you have these debates in the Kannada literary world where there is an attempt to reformulate the notion of the environment and the notion of the survival of the ecology. These cultural writings, of course, respond very creatively to what was happening elsewhere, not only in the intellectual circles in India, but outside India too. As I said earlier, this is an indication of the dialogue between the regional Kannada sensibility and what was happening globally elsewhere. Apart from the preoccupation with ecology and environment, caste also becomes a major theme for exploration as far as the cultural and the political writings are concerned. I have already made a mention of the fact that most of the political and cultural writings in Kannada have been influenced by the ideological positions of Gandhi, Marx and Lohia and Ambedkar. Now when we look at the important cultural and political writings in Kannada about the issue of caste, we find that Kannada writers were trying to see a model of explaining caste society, describing caste society, and a model of negotiating with the problems created by the caste system by drawing on these very different ideological positions. It was once again writers like Yuvaranand Murthy and P. Lankesh who had made caste a central issue in their creative writings. The mention has to be made of the popular writer S.L. Bhairappa, who from his own slightly conservative position also looked at the problems of a caste society. Now, these major works of creative fiction immediately led in the Kannada civil society to a huge debate on the nature of caste in the modern world. So, taking cues from the writings of especially Lohia and Gandhi, the Kannada writers were trying to reinterpret the nature of caste society. In fact, a number of organizations in the 1970s and 1980s, they openly declared their allegiance to the Ambedkarite ideology of annihilating caste system and moving away from the spiritualistic position of Gandhi. So we have very important and seminal writings in Kannada from an Ambedkarite position. I have already referred to the prose writings of Devanuru Mahadeva, but a large number of writers from the Dalit and the Bandaya group were writing about caste. They were writing about the empirical experiences of individuals who are caught in the whirlpool of caste society. This debate has been revived recently, and this debate now is taking place under the rubric of very large intellectual positions, which include the Orientalist, the post-Orientalist and the post-structuralist positions on the understanding of social formations and social structures. So, if this is one major area addressed by the major Kannada writers in their political and cultural writings, there has also been an attempt to understand the global processes of what goes by the name of globalization or the new world economic order. In fact, one could say with confidence that the enormous amount of writing that is available in Kannada on the processes of globalization can be a very valid contribution to the understanding of globalization and the neoliberal economic policies and the impact of these policies on regional languages and regional societies and cultures. We already have a tradition of more than a decade and a half of writings on globalization in Kannada. Many of these writings are extremely well informed, and they respond to a number of theoretical positions taken up by scholars in the world elsewhere. On the whole, one could say that the perspective developed over these decades on globalization is a very critical one. It has created a strong critique of the very processes of globalization. There have been very few supporters of the benefits of globalization or the possibilities of bending the process of globalization towards social justice in Kannada. Most of the Kannada writers have taken a position from which they argue that given the inherent well-established inequalities of Indian society, globalization is likely to increase these inequalities, to strengthen these inequalities, rather than bring opportunities to all the subject members of this modern society. It's not an exaggeration to say that this chunk of writing on globalization in Kannada, it provides a third world post-colonial perspective on the growth of capital across the world. There are a number of very important scholars in Kannada who have been writing from a Marxist and a neo-Marxist position on globalization. It is these writers who have tried to understand not just the original Marxist interpretation of a capitalist society, which was based, of course, on Marx's own observation of what was happening in the industrial and the post-industrial European society, but the attempt by the Kannada writers is try to see what shape is taken by capital in the contemporary world in a caste-centric society. What does capital do to these little societies here in India which have a regional ethos and a regional history? What are the possible threats to the survival of these regional languages and regional cultures? These have been the important concerns of at least two generations of writers in Kannada who have been talking about globalization, and there seems to be a collective debate on this issue, which makes the writing very pertinent and very relevant. All across Karnataka, there have been very frequent debates on the nature of what is known as neo-colonialism or the new version of capitalism. In fact, this is one reason why the writings, for example, of Terry Eagleton and Antonio Gramsci from the earlier period have been translated into Kannada, and these translated works have drawn a very involved sort of commentary and debate from the Kannada readers. In fact, almost all the major thinkers belonging to the critical school in Europe are available in Kannada translation. And these translations have taken forward the Kannada debate on contemporary society in the presence of the processes of globalization. Other movements which took place in Karnataka in the recent years, for example, the Dalit movement, the farmers movement, and the movement in favor of a local kind of a political structure. All these debates surrounding the major political movements in Karnataka have been the subject for the political and the cultural writings. A mention has to be made of the role played by the journals and the magazines in Kannada in circulating and disseminating the cultural and the political debates which have taken place in Kannada language. For example, the weekly tabloid Lankesh Patrike, edited by P. Lankesh, provided a forum for a very lively debate on the movements which in a way converged with the 20 years of the publication of this tabloid. So what was happening with the help of Lankesh Patrike was a very immediate response to these social and political events was being recorded and analyzed and was being responded to by members of the Kannada society from all kinds of locations, urban and rural, upper caste and lower caste. This was complemented by the space which was provided even in the literary journals of the time. I have already mentioned how the little journal Sakshi, and I should also mention another little journal Sankramana, which provided a fair amount of space to cultural and political debates in Kannada. In fact, I think one has to go by a statement made by Professor Anant Murthy decades ago that strictly speaking, there is no critical writing in Kannada which is also not cultural and political at the same time. This also holds good as far as the very important contribution of D.R. Nagaraj is concerned. D.R. Nagaraj was not only a Kannada intellectual, very thoroughly immersed in all the local literary cultural traditions of Karnataka, but also a leading third world intellectual who was trying to make a contribution to a very important intellectual enterprise. This was the intellectual enterprise of trying to decolonize our knowledge, trying to decolonize our understanding of history, of culture and of literature, to try to free our minds from the consequences of the colonial impact on our sensibility. The other aspect of this intellectual adventure taken up by D.R. Nagaraj was to try to look at the possibilities of using the imaginative, artistic aspects of the Shudra and the Dalit traditions. He was of the opinion that it is not just an overt political struggle against the mainstream which can really sustain people's movements. It was necessary also to return to the cultural and artistic resources which are available in the little traditions, in the minor traditions, which never found articulation in the canonical works in Kannada. Therefore, D.R. Nagaraj edited, in fact, a number of booklets which dealt with some of these unheard voices in the Indian philosophical and the Shastric traditions. In his own cultural writings, D.R. Nagaraj not only looked at the complexities and even absurdities of 20th century Indian politics, but he was also trying to find a way out where it would be possible to bring together the awakened consciousness of the Dalits and the backward communities and the progressive elements in the so-called upper caste communities. He believed that it would be possible to create a political praxis in which a blend could be made of the aspirations of the subaltern communities and also the inherently progressive and humanistic traditions which were part of the canonical or the major tradition in Kannada. It's a tribute to the intellectual work done by the late D.R. Nagaraj that his writings continue to provide Kannada writers with the frameworks within which the relevant discussions can continue in Kannada as far as the cultural and the political issues are concerned. Another contribution of D.R. Nagaraj, which has very greatly influenced many of the younger writers today, is the position that he took on nativism as against the impact of Orientalism, of colonialism on Indian sensibility. D.R. Nagaraj was, of course, proposing a return to the indigenous, the regional resources. At the same time, he was somewhat doubtful, somewhat skeptical about a mere return to the nativistic sources. He was thinking of the challenges of a modern society which requires us not just to return to these resources but to reformulate them, but maybe to rewrite them. In the last work that he left behind, D.R. Nagaraj was returning to the work of the Vachanakaras in 12th century Karnataka. But he was doing this with a very specific intellectual objective. He was trying to establish the role and the importance of a regional intellectual movement, such as the one which was led by the Vachanakaras in 12th century Karnataka, in relation to the major philosophical and the religious traditions in India. If we look at the important last work on Veerashaivism, on Vachanakaras, on in fact the broader tradition of Shaiva religion and philosophy, and also his other writings on the Bhakti tradition, one can see the possibilities of a very different kind of understanding of Indian tradition and culture. Equally important are the writings of D.R. Nagaraj as far as Ambedkar and Gandhi are concerned. In fact, he was among the first important intellectuals in India to try to bring together the Gandhian position and the position of Ambedkar. In his important work, Flaming Feet, D.R. Nagaraj made this attempt to see if it was possible to reconcile the Gandhian and the Ambedkarite positions. It is in this way that the major writers in Kannada have made a direct intervention in issues relating to culture and politics, not only through their creative writing, but also through the very prolific contribution they have made to the cultural and the political writings in Kannada. Therefore, one could suggest that in the cultural and the political writings in Kannada, we have a very rich, complex body of writing which deserves very close critical attention if we want to take forward a third world, post-colonial perspective on both culture and politics. Thank you.